Okay, and our next speaker is Cristina Williamson from the University of Bergen Department of Information Science and Media Studies. And her topic is the subject and the form, inquiries into formal analysis. Let us welcome Ia.
Thank you very much. So I'm a PhD student in Bergen, and I did my master's degree at ITU in game studies. And I've always been labeled a formalist, and I've always been labeled a structuralist. Maybe that stuff is contagious from Esben Aarseth. But starting with my PhD research, knowing that I have plenty of time to do what I do, I started getting this kind of uneasy feeling about formalism and formal analysis. So in my research proposal that got me accepted to the PhD, I had written clearly that I wanted to conduct a formal analysis of this and this game in order to find out something. But looking through the literature, I realized that the formal analysis in the context of games is actually very rarely defined. Lankowski and Björk treat it in a chapter in their game methods book, and David Meyer talks about it in Play Redux, but it's only ever vaguely defined and kind of reappropriated in the context of game studies. And the primary problem I had with both of these approaches is the role of the subject. Because I think the subject, as we have already discussed widely here at the conference and other conferences, is of some significant importance when we talk about games. In the formal analysis, we have to first focus on what formal is. So in the Scandinavian languages, we have a distinction between formal and formel, which maybe in English better translates to formalist versus formula in a way. So formal would refer to the form of something, whereas formel would be like mathematical reasoning. So in the formal analysis or the formalist analysis, there's a focus on the form. And that also means that I will today talk more about formalism than I will talk, for instance, about formal logic. I'm sorry to those who are more interested in that. More in detail, I'm going to go through formalism in the tradition of Russian formalism, aesthetic formalism, and then I'm going to approach structuralism in relation to formalism and how those two are actually often kind of mistaken for one another. I will rephrase it as system-centrism because I think structuralism refers to a historical paradigm and specific thinkers, but I'll return to that later. Russian formalism is a particular historical entity of the 1920s, and most of us probably know it because of Roman Jakobsen. He argued that basically in this formalism we should focus on literary scholarship as its own distinct field. So it's definitely kind of a political movement. But he's also maybe most famous for, here quoting, that the focus of this literary scholarship be not on literature in its totality, but literariness or literaturnost. That is that which makes of a given work a work of literature. So the focus is on like the poetic language and how words become like an autonomous source of pleasure. And here, of course, the intention is to isolate all kind of social, cultural, historical context and just focus on the work in question. But already by calling out these sources of pleasure in the work, there's an implication of the work as an aesthetic artifact that relies on kind of an aesthetic evaluation, and that there's also a subject to evaluate the work in question. Now this becomes particularly evident when Tunuyanov redefines a literary work as an aesthetic system, because there are very clear implications of aesthetic evaluation, judgment, contemplation, call it whatever you want, where the subject is indeed central suddenly, not necessarily the historical subject, but a subject. And according to Swingwood and Warg, it also marks, like Tunuyanov's redefinition, a shift from the more almost intrinsic approach to literature towards like a socially and historically grounded understanding. And I think we also see that in the development of new criticism in the States, right? Now David Myers argues that a close reading is actually the same as a formal analysis and that the close reading is the formal analysis, but that's not the case in how the Russian formalists present it. Close reading is definitely a method of new criticism, and that kind of also tries to approach, you know, the intrinsics of the literary work, but with the development it also became less focused on only the work, but on applying various lenses, right? To conduct a Marxist reading or a feminist reading. That would be a close reading, but that would not just be for the like intrinsic qualities of the work in question. Now, aesthetic formalism, on the other hand, is not like Russian formalism, a historical paradigm. It's rather, according to Audi, a type of theory which emphasizes form in the study of a specific aesthetic artifact. And it can be understood on a continuum, so a theory can be conceived of as more or less formalist. And basically, you can evaluate whether a theory is aesthetic formalist theory by investigating whether it's dealing with aesthetic artifacts or works, and if it's formalist, by contrasting that artifact to outside entities. And in this kind of aesthetic evaluation becomes even more apparent, right? Because now I'm not an aesthetic philosopher, but in so many takes on aesthetic contemplation, the subject is central. Very much so in Kant's theory, but even like in Schopenhauer's critique of Kant, where the focus is to Schopenhauer to kind of isolate the subject and the object, but in the end he fails in doing so and has to acknowledge that the subject is actually central in the relation to the will. But when we investigate aesthetic artifacts, right, we don't necessarily have to focus on the historical subject. Thank God Isa came up with the implied reader and Espen redefined the implied player. But my argument is that maybe sometimes it's not enough to have a single implied player. Because we play in so many different ways, so many games have various endings depending on your play style. So maybe a single implied player is still a little too naive to kind of really conceive of these various types of aesthetic evaluation that we can perform. Now, the next argument I will present is that form is not the same as structure, and that this is something we too often conflict with each other. So I said earlier that I'm often called a structuralist. And to me, structuralism refers to a historical entity, to various scholars, Saussure, Lévi-Strauss, and so on. So I think it's a problematic term to kind of use for labeling studies that work systematically or structurally with concepts. That's why I suggest system centrism. It may not be a good term, but then at least I avoid referring to the school of thought of structuralism. But according to the Cambridge Dictionary, structuralism is a system of ideas used in the study of language, literature, art, anthropology, and sociology that emphasizes the importance of the basic structures and relationships of that particular subject. So, kind of removing the historical situatedness, system centrism accounts for the emphasis on this basic structures of the object or a subject under investigation without referring to it as structuralist. That means that it does not necessarily favor a specific form. Working from a system-centric perspective, we don't have to accept any kind of like basic ontology. We can widely disagree about the form of video games while still working system-centrically, because it just simply emphasizes the structural components of the work that we're studying as something that is a system containing various elements, and it's kind of like a composite structure. That also means that it's not a theory, but rather a scientific approach or a specific method for studying said object. But it's, as I said, very easy to confuse system centrism and formalism, maybe even especially aesthetic formalism, because most formalist studies work from a system-centric perspective. Right? They are structuralist in nature. We talk about Roman Jakobsen as a formalist, but also very much as a structuralist. But system centrism does not have to favor form, because we can even think of many system-centric approaches to games and player studies, for example, that don't deal with the form of video games, but that very much work from a systematic kind of approach. For instance, Nagy's player studies, Bartle's player type. Of course, with the case of Bartle, you can argue that then we're talking about the form of the player and it becomes another object under investigation. But I think that we see that there are player studies that are very system-centric without being formalist. Now, I want to take this to discuss the kind of research perspectives that we see in game studies. So using it as a springboard to kind of criticize the distinction that we often make between the game as object and the game as process. And Espen also suggested this division of the empirical object in game studies in a text from 2009, where he argues that we can basically see the game object as two different empirical objects. The game as process, which is the game as played, and the game object consisting of game mechanics and game world. And that we need different methods for studying those two. It becomes even more clear in a later illustration that I'll have in a moment. But it seems that there's a link between the game as object and formalism, right? Because treating the game as something that's independent from its being a process also kind of isolate the subject and kind of promotes this intrinsic approach to it. But as we know, games are a special kind of objects, right? They need players to exist. They need players to be actualized. Maybe many people would even argue that games are a different object depending on who plays them, right? Justina's bio object, that it's actually a different object that I'm actualizing when I play The Witcher being a nasty Geralt than when I play The Witcher being super nice to Ciri. Those are two different games. And we also need to have that knowledge of how they have been played in order to really understand a thorough analysis of the games. So maybe, as I said before, an individual implied player is not even enough to conceive of these game as objects or a game as objects in plural, because they can take so many various forms. And I don't think then that it even makes sense to equate the player's role in game studies with the reader's role in Russian formalism, even though like the subject was already integrated in the Russian formalism way of reasoning. Again, because in games there are no objects in their own right. They don't exist independently of us. We need to start them and run them. Some games can be played by themselves, like everything. As soon as you launch everything, it will automatically start playing itself at some point. And we can argue if that's a game or not. But they are always objects and processes. So basically, my argument is that Rune and Daniel and Ollie and Sebastian probably got it right in studying it from a phenomenological perspective. Instead of focusing again on the historical player, kind of making central the subject in approaching the game. Because I'm not saying that we all have to go out and interview players before we can analyze a game. That's not productive. But accepting that the subject is actually already in the Russian formalism central to kind of the aesthetic appreciation and the evaluation of the object is kind of, I think phenomenology is a nice word around that. Yeah, so I wanted to include a definition of formal analysis. This is from Lankowski and Björk, who define it as formal analysis focuses on the different elements of a work that is asking questions about the elements that constitute the parts of the work and the role of each element in the composition as a whole. So like using the vocabulary I've now introduced, this can be considered a method of aesthetic formalism, right? Although Audi talked about theories, this definitely fulfilled the requirement of kind of putting the object in relation to outside entities, but kind of as a contrast to that. But it can also be considered a system-centric because it focuses on these elements that constitute the parts of the whole. And the subject is implied because they're talking about the game as a work. And as a work, we're already talking aesthetic artifacts, right? I don't want to go too deep into the whole Foucault discussion of works. But the next question then is what those different elements are. I don't know if I'm completely running out of time. And that's what we see in all of these, by now, slightly fashionable suggestions of game ontologies, right? That's often, as someone pointed out yesterday, ontology as taxonomy. For instance, a game ontology project, which sets out to develop a game ontology that identifies the important structural elements of games and the relationships between them, organizing them hierarchically. So these ontologies are trying to map out what the structure, what the form of games are, but also what the elements that we should prioritize in a sense in the analysis. What are the core pillars of games? And as such, we actually see something similar in many game definitions, like evident structural elements of games, right? We have these 7 elements that are like the defining characteristics of games that form together like this computer science-y version of ontology as taxonomy. And so the game ontology project seems system-centric by method and formalist in its approaching gameness, right? In approaching the form of games. But what actually gives games a form is a question I don't think you actually managed to answer at the games definition workshop, right? Because we can't freaking answer that question. It's political, it's ideological, and it very much depends on where we want to go with our research. Our background, who gives us funding, because let's be real, we can never really agree on what games are. Now, taking all of this into perspective, I think that the current research perspectives that are listed by Espen Aase seem they're put into question, to put it nicely, right? This is the model I was referring to before, where it's even more demarcated. The empirical focus can be either of the game as artwork, like an aesthetic artifact, of the game as a system, or of the game as a player activity, and then it can be relatively, respectively, prescriptive or descriptive. And then we end up with these 6 categories of critical, exploratory, utilitarian, aesthetic, ontological, and clinical. But as we saw, we can work system-centrically with player studies. We approach games as aesthetic artifacts in accepting, the tradition of formalism and in performing formal analyses where we see the game as a work. So actually these boundaries aren't even there. And then I think it's problematic to kind of promote it. I mean, of course, again, we can probably blame the institutionalization of game studies depending on what department we're in. We probably have to let some boss know that we approach games from this and this perspective because it sounds nicer, but these kind of distinctions are rather arbitrary. Ontological work with games, formalist ontological work with games, is also aesthetic by nature, because formalism deals with aesthetic artifacts, and in the aesthetic evaluation, the subject is always central, right? So that is basically combining all of those 3 in the category of ontological approaches to it. So my conclusion now, after my speech run, is that it's rather naive, and I'm sorry if this sounds really aggressive, but it's rather naive to assume that a formalist study of the game as object negates all understanding of the subject, right? We can never completely isolate the game from the player. And if we accept games as works or as aesthetic artifacts, that implies, no, it doesn't even imply, it actually gives a significant role of the subject in question, where I say that phenomenology might be then a nice and easy way to handle it. And even an implied subject kind of negates this initial attempt of intrinsic understandings of objects, right, in the Russian formalism. That was never really there. And then finally, that there's this very notable difference between form and structure, form and system centrism. And we need to be more precise when we use those labels, both on the work that we're conducting, but also people, because formalism is not inherent in system-centric thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Ia. I wonder if there are questions. I see Pavel first and there second. Pavel, go ahead.
So, thanks. I think that your argument works, but it rests on a very specific, and you admitted it yourself, on a very specific understanding of formalism that was used in Russian formalism. Because if you didn't have Russian formalism, the argument wouldn't work. Because all the other uses of the term formalism are exactly like what you criticize. So I would say that Russian formalism is the odd one out. That it is in a way similar. There is a similarity of the notion of of formalism in Russian formalism, and how the term formalism is used in different disciplines, or in philosophy, for example. And this similarity is simply that both abstract from the content. That's the point. If you take a sentence and abstract from the content of the sentence, but start to think about the emotional or aesthetic value of the particular words, this is why it's called formalism. But of course, again, it is kind of abstracted from the content in the sense of the content of the sentence, but not from the content in the sense of the aesthetic content. So that's why it is not a typical usage. But I would say that argument works only because this is this very specific usage that encompasses aesthetics into formal analysis and does not treat aesthetics as content. But it's a very specific use.
Well, I think you're right insofar that Russian formalism is a special kind of formalism, and Audi's take on aesthetic formalism is a specific kind of formalism. But those are the formalisms that are quoted in the game studies literature that tries to deal with formal analysis. I haven't seen any other types of formalism quoted in relation to formal analysis, either in the work of Lankowski and Piak or in David Meyer's work. And they build the argument that the subject is kind of not there, not important, on Russian formalism. And that, I think, I can argue very well with this line of reasoning, is simply incorrect. I hope that...
I don't get it. I think that all of them use the notion of formalism exactly as it is used in philosophy. That is, basically they study formal aspects that is independent from the content.
So,
That's it. So like structural aspects, or I don't know, number of elements, things like that. And this is what they study. This is how, if you look at their ontological classification, this is what they study. They abstract away from how the game looks, what the game is about, and they study how the game functions. What type of system is it? What elements does it have? And stuff like this. And this is like a very typical understanding of the notion of formalism,
but,
unlike Russian formalism.
But this, I argue this isn't formalism. Like the analysis that you present, that I have also referred to as formal analysis, isn't what formal analysis is. We can't just take the term and make it mean something else. That is a content analysis.
No.
Listing the elements is listing content of a game. And that is not what the formal analysis was in the Russian tradition. And therefore, it seems weird to me. I mean, that's not how Lankarsky and Björk define it, right? They define it very much actually in line with how Foucault defines a work. That it focuses on these different elements of a work, asking questions about what constitute parts of the work and the role of each element in the composition as a whole. But there's always this reference to the work, not to the object. And I think it's very inherent in their line of thinking. And David Myers worked on it. I'm sorry he's not here to say that himself, but basically half his chapter is just going through the history of Russian formalism. So I think that builds very much on that. I'm not saying that there's not a philosophical formalism to be used, but I think it's very problematic if we use terms that have been used in the study of literature and just kind of reform them into something else that they're not really. So I try to backtrack and see how formalism has been used in other examples and what that actually means for these kind of research perspectives.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I disagree, because I think that it is Russian formalism that uses it in a specific sense, and the other guys basically are using it in a well-established sense. But
I think disagreeing on this might be the most productive thing to do, right? I'd be
yeah,
a bit unhappy if everyone was like, you're right, let's go on.
I'm just saying the popularity of the term is... Okay.
Thank you, Pavel. Would you mind turning off your mic?
It always sounds so impressive.
And there was a question over there. Would you mind going to a microphone, please?
Well, yes. I guess I can do that.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. Well, I have. It's less a question and more a comment, I guess, because you see, the discussion about literaturность is still on in Russian in Russian academia, and recently I was lucky to attend Sergei Zenkin's presentation of his newly published book. Sergei Zenkin is one of the most prominent contemporary Russian literary studies persons. So, and he stated this question, Russian formalists stated 100 years ago about the ontology of a literary object. And he counterposed literary theory to Marxist readings and feminist readings and post-colonial readings in the following fashion. He said that, for example, if you conduct some Marxist readings of a certain literary object, you presuppose the existence of a literary object. So you kind of skip the ontological question about what literature is, and you operate with it as if it already existed before you took it from a bookshelf. Yeah. So it's like if you say something like, I'm doing some Marxist readings, I read this book from a Marxist perspective, then you must first constitute this book, what a book is, and so on and so on. So that was his way of counterposing literary theory to Marxist readings and close readings and etc. etc. And I guess this is a powerful move because it first of all it makes us think of ontology of a literary object, or in our case a game object, every time we do it. And of course it also gives us an opportunity to redefine the object basing on the ideology we approach it with. Because, for example, well, if we accept Zenkin's understanding, then we must accept that, for example, if we approach some game and conduct a feminist reading of it, first we need to define what is a game from a feminist ideological perspective, and so on and so on.
But I think that's also what's called for in game studies now, right?
Yes, yes. But the question, and here I have a question.
Yeah.
So, do you think we should do that every time we approach a game from a certain perspective? For example, I want to establish some Marxist or feminist Marxist close reading of a given game. So, should I first define what I think a game is in a given paper?
I mean, for ultimate good scholarship, yes. I mean, in practice, it's not going to work. Just like we should define all the terms we use, right? That's why so many terms are a mess, because people use them in various ways. Like, simply avatar that I work with personally. Avatar means so many different things to so many people who don't even define it when they use it. But I think it would be super productive, but who would do it, right? Maybe it's the responsible thing to do when you write a dissertation. There you should force students to do so. Now, I don't think you write a dissertation simply on a feminist reading of some game. But maybe that's enough for it. I don't think so. But I think, yes, you should, but no, we won't, if that's a fair answer.
Yes.
I think there are many things we should do to be more precise, especially when we work theoretically with games. But just because I say that we should, it doesn't make people do it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Going 1, 2, takers, and going 3. Thank you, Io, for your presentation.